So, too hard to see? We need to align the causes with different definitions. And so I've broken it down here into sudden and severe natural disasters, which we've spoken about. Environmental degradation, a state's loss of all of its territory, like the submerged islands, a state's loss of some of its territory, which would be, for example, Bangladesh being the most vulnerable country in the world. Conflict, in terms of ordinary conflict, an ordinary armed conflict, and also restricted use for high-risk land zones, and we'll go through that in a minute. If people still hear me when I'm walking backwards, can you, yeah. Sometimes governments will rule off particular areas, and a good example of that is in Sri Lanka following a tsunami. The government said you've got to be outside you can't live within 100 metres of the coast, and that caused a lot of problems. But initially they kicked everyone out of the 100 metres, and then people would move back. Then there was a lack of clarity because it was 100 metres, then it changed to 300 metres, etc. And so there were resettlements and forced resettlements and displacements, ostensibly under the basis of protecting people, but in many cases it caused more hardship for a long period of time, because people had to leave their land, their homes, they lost value. So there are issues there as well. Sorry about jumping around, but can we move back up? Yeah, for the moment. Up. Okay, is that it? Yeah. Okay, so international law makes a series of distinctions. And these distinctions are, if a person is displaced but stays within its state, the person stays under the own national law, and an international soft law document called the Guiding Principles on Internal Displacement applies, and these people are talked about as internally displaced persons, or IDPs. Pop up a minute. Now, sorry. Yes. Okay, and so this is a soft law instrument. It's not like a convention, it's not binding, it's just a normative guide, and it says that persons or groups of persons who have been forced or obliged to flee their home can be identified as internally displaced persons and should be afforded the protections within these guidelines. And this guideline actually includes natural disasters. So there is an international normative framework applying to some people, some movements within the state, but it's not binding, and even states that have adopted generally the policies don't always observe them, but that goes for other international law as well. I think the important difference to note in relation to IDPs is that there really is nothing to compel the state to do anything. The protections that are suggested under these guiding principles are up to the state. So really, if you are, wherever you come from, whatever state you come from, one of the actions that I think you could do, or maybe for the Assembly later on, is to encourage adoption of these IDP principles into national legislation or international policy. Okay. Okay, so the next one, the second series of distinction, the distinction that we've already covered is movement in a state or movement outside, across a border. And so if you move across a border under international law, you're covered by refugee law. But again, it doesn't apply to environment, natural disaster. No. Okay. Yeah. And then finally, there's a distinction between forced and voluntary movements. So voluntary movements are covered by, considered to be migration, covered by Migrant Workers Convention, and the forced movements like the refugee, like the Refugee Convention, like the internally displaced persons guiding principles, they're covered under those instruments. Okay. And I think we've covered these already, but just the typologies between natural and a man-made disaster: sudden, slow onset, and temporary and permanent. It's just also good to note that part of the gap in this normative framework was addressed by another soft law instrument encouraging states to do certain actions in natural disasters, and this covers IDPs. Following natural disasters, it's broader than just displaced persons. It covers principles for protecting all sorts of protections, all sorts of affected people. Okay. Okay. No. I would like to go back to that slide actually, explain it a little more. So I think I'm still under time for the moment, but running over. So what I've done here is the type of environmental condition. If it's sudden, the duration of the migration, most of the time for sudden and severe natural disasters, we're going to see temporary, and up until now the migration has been temporary. People move back to where they have been, but increasingly there will be permanent moves. So we can say it's forced or compelled. People don't want to move in this situation, and